The dust of Pine Creek settled on everything, a fine red powder that clung to boots, settled in the creases of a man's hat, and painted the afternoon sun a hazy shade of rust. Daniel Cooper felt it on his tongue. He stood across from the stagecoach depot, his good black coat feeling too warm and his starched collar too tight. For 6 months, he had corresponded with Margaret, a woman from Ohio whose letters promised a gentle nature and a desire for the quiet life he craved. A life of predictable seasons, of fences mended and stock counted, a partner. That was all he wanted. A steady, quiet presence to fill the hollow echo in his ranch house. The rumble came first, a distant tremor through the soles of his boots. Then the coach appeared, a black beetle crawling out of the vast, sun-bleached prairie. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. Jake Morrison, the blacksmith, paused with his hammer mid-swing. The silence from his smithy an event in itself. Sarah, his wife, wiped her hands on her apron at the door of their small home. Mayor Whitman adjusted his spectacles from the porch of the general store, his wife Barbara peering over his shoulder, her gaze sharp as a new needle. They were all waiting to see the woman who would be Mrs. Daniel Cooper. Daniel took off his hat, a nervous habit, and began turning the brim in his hands. The leather was worn smooth from years of this same motion. The coach groaned to a stop, the horses blowing and stamping, their hides slick with sweat. The driver, a man named Henderson with a face like a dried apple, looped the reins and grunted. The door swung open. A boot appeared first, a lady's boot, fine black leather, not the sturdy, sensible footwear of a frontier woman. It was followed by the hem of a dress, a startling slash of emerald green against the dun-colored street. The woman who emerged was not the plain, serene face from the small photograph Margaret had sent. This woman's hair was a fiery cascade of red, pinned up but threatening to escape. Her eyes, when they swept the small crowd and landed on him, were the same deep, vibrant green as her dress. She stood tall, her shoulders straight, a woman who owned the ground she stood on. She carried no luggage, only a small reticule. Her expression was unreadable, a careful composition of polite neutrality. Daniel took a half-step forward, his heart a confused drum against his ribs. This was not Margaret. Her gaze was direct, unwavering. She moved toward him, her steps measured and confident, the fine fabric of her dress whispering against the dust. She stopped a few feet away, close enough that he could see the faint dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose. Her voice, when she spoke, was not gentle. It was clear and carried a crisp edge, like the wind that whipped down from the mountains in early spring. "Mr. Cooper." He could only nod, his own voice lost somewhere in his throat. "My name is Evelyn Winters. I am Margaret's cousin." She paused, letting the information settle. "Your bride will not be coming." The word struck him with the force of a physical blow. The street, the watching faces, the very air seemed to waver. All his carefully laid plans, his visions of a quiet future, crumbled into dust as fine as the powder on his boots. He looked at this woman, this stranger in her impossible green dress, and a single, sharp thought cut through his disbelief. I was ready for a quiet marriage, until the fire in her voice burned all my plans to the ground. He found his voice, a low, rough thing. "What do you mean?" "Just what I said. Mr. Cooper, she is not on the coach. She is not coming to Pine Creek." Behind him, he heard a murmur ripple through the onlookers. Barbara Whitman whispered something to her husband, her eyes fixed on Evelyn. Daniel felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up his neck. To be left at the altar was one thing. To have it announced on Main Street by a woman who looked like she had just stepped out of a Chicago parlor was another entirely. "Is she well?" he managed to ask, the question a matter of decency more than curiosity. "She has a lung affliction," Evelyn Winters said, her tone softening just a fraction. The doctor advised against the journey. "The air here," he said, would be too harsh for her constitution. She held out a sealed envelope. She wrote you a letter. It explains everything. Daniel took it, his fingers brushing hers. Her skin was cool, a strange contrast to the heat of his own. He did not open it. He did not need to. The finality was in her eyes. The stagecoach driver started unloading trunks from the back. One appeared, then a second. They were large, well-made, and heavy. Then a third, this one longer and narrower than the others. "Those are yours?" Daniel asked, gesturing with his hat. "They are," she confirmed. "My tools of the trade." The thought that she had come in Margaret's place, as some sort of substitute, flickered and died. 3 trunks full of tools did not belong to a woman looking to be a rancher's wife. They belonged to a woman with her own purpose. The crowd was not dispersing. If anything, it was growing. Daniel knew what they were thinking. He knew the questions that would be whispered over dinner tables that night. He had to get them out of the street. "The hotel is this way," he said, his voice flat. He turned and started walking, not waiting to see if she would follow. He heard the whisper of her dress behind him, a constant, rustling reminder of his upended future. The hotel lobby was small and smelled of stale cigar smoke and lemon polish. A worn Turkish rug, its colors faded to muted reds and blues, covered the floor. Daniel led her to a pair of chairs in a corner away from the front window. She sat with a straight back, placing her reticule in her lap, her hands folded neatly on top of it. She looked perfectly composed, as if she announced the cancellation of weddings every day. Daniel remained standing, turning the letter over in his hands. "You came a long way to deliver a letter, Miss Winters." "I did," she said. "Margaret is my family." She felt a personal apology was required, and since she could not deliver it, I offered to do so in her stead. "And," she added, her green eyes meeting his, "I had my own reasons for wanting to come west." There it was. The second part of the story. He opened the letter. The handwriting was faint and spidery, the words full of apology and regret. It spoke of a recurring illness, of a doctor's grim prognosis, of her sorrow at causing him public humiliation. It was a kind letter, the letter of the gentle woman he had imagined. He folded it and put it in his coat pocket. "I see," he said. The word felt inadequate. "Mr. Cooper," she began, leaning forward slightly. Her voice was lower now, meant only for him. "I am not blind. I saw the faces in the street. I know how this looks for you, and I know how it looks for me. A single woman arriving in a new town under these circumstances." He said nothing, waiting. "Gossip in a place like this," she continued, "can be more damaging than a winter storm. It can isolate a man and ruin a woman." He had to admit she was right. He was already bracing himself for the sympathetic looks, the poorly veiled jokes from the men at the saloon. For a woman, it would be worse. She would be labeled, judged, her every move scrutinized. "I have no intention of being ruined. Mr. Cooper, I came to Pine Creek to start a new life, to open a dressmaking business. Those trunks contain everything I need, my sewing machine, fabrics, patterns, all of it." Daniel finally looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the steel in her posture. This was not a woman adrift. This was a woman with a plan that had been disrupted, but not destroyed. "I have some savings," she went on, "enough to get started. But I will need a place to work, and I will need to establish a reputation. Both will be difficult if the town believes I'm a woman of questionable character who arrived under a cloud of scandal." He was starting to see where she was going. The thought was audacious, unexpected. "You, Mr. Cooper, are in a similar predicament. You are a respected man here, I gather, but you have been publicly jilted. The town will pity you, and pity is a bitter draught to swallow." Ooh, she was right about that. Too, he hated the idea of it. "So I propose a trade," she said, her voice firm and clear. "A deal of honor. We can help each other. You need to salvage your dignity. I need to establish my respectability. If you were to help me secure a place for my shop, introduce me to the right people, lend me your good name as a sponsor of sorts, it would change the narrative. The story would no longer be about the rancher who was abandoned. It would be about the gentleman who, despite his own disappointment, helped a lady in need establish a respectable business. The sheer, practical brilliance of it stunned him. It was a move as calculated as a chess game. She was offering him a way to turn his humiliation into an act of civic virtue, and in doing so, she would get exactly what she needed. You would be seen as magnanimous, she pressed, seeing the consideration in his face. I would be seen as a legitimate businesswoman under the protection of a prominent citizen. We solve each other's problems. Mr. Cooper, no pity, no scandal, just a simple, respectable business arrangement. He thought about the small, vacant kiosk he owned on Main Street, the one next to the Mercantile. It had been sitting empty for months. It was small, but it had a good front window and a small room in the back. I own a small shop, he heard himself say. It is not much, but it is on the main thoroughfare. A flicker of relief, the first genuine emotion he had seen from her, crossed her face. Would you be willing to rent it to me? I would. At a fair price, she insisted. This cannot be charity. It must be business. I will pay my own way. Of course, he said. He admired her pride. It was a quality he understood. Then we have a deal, she asked. And for the first time, she stood up. She was taller than he had realized. She extended a gloved hand. He looked at her hand, then back to her face. He was a rancher. He dealt in cattle and land, in things he could see and touch. He had wanted a simple, quiet life. This woman, with her emerald dress and her sharp mind and her business proposals, was anything but simple or quiet. She was a complication he had never anticipated, but she was also offering a solution, a way out of the hole he had just fallen into. He thought of the whispers, the stares, the long, lonely ride back to his empty house. Then he thought of her proposal, a clean, honorable transaction. He took her hand. Her grip was firm, her glove made of soft kid leather. The handshake was meant to be a business agreement, a cool and calculated contract. But as his fingers closed around hers, a strange current passed between them, a spark of heat that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the unexpected fire in the woman standing before him. It was the sealing of a pact, an alliance born of mutual necessity in the dusty lobby of the Pine Creek Hotel. And in that moment, Daniel Cooper knew that his life, which he had so carefully planned to be a calm and placid stream, had just been diverted into a deep and unpredictable canyon. The future was no longer a known territory. It was a wilderness, and he had just agreed to let this woman be his guide. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the distant, metallic tang of Jake Morrison's smithy. Daniel led Evelyn Winters down the boardwalk, the wood groaning under his weight. He was acutely aware of the silence that fell as they passed the general store, the way curtains twitched in windows. He kept his eyes forward, his stride even. He was Daniel Cooper, a man of his word, and he was conducting business. That was the story, and he would stick to it. The shop was small, wedged between the Mercantile and the land office. Its window was gray with a film of dust, and the sign above it was blank, the paint long since peeled away by the relentless Montana sun and wind. He unlocked the door with a key from a ring in his pocket, the mechanism protesting with a rusty squeal. He pushed the door open into a square room filled with slanting bars of dusty sunlight. The air was stale, thick with the ghosts of past enterprises, a failed bakery, and before that, a short-lived cobbler's shop. A simple wooden counter ran along one wall, and behind it, a doorway led to a smaller back room. A steep, narrow staircase was built against the far wall, leading up to a cramped loft. "It is not much," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. Evelyn did not seem to hear him. She had walked to the center of the room. turning in a slow circle. Her gaze was not on the dirt or the cobwebs, but on the large front window. "The light," she said, her voice soft with an almost reverent quality. "The morning light is perfect. It will not cast a yellow pall on the fabrics." She moved to the staircase and looked up. "And that loft? A place to store things. I suppose it is not finished." "May I?" Without waiting for an answer, she ascended the narrow stairs. He watched the hem of her emerald dress disappear, then followed, his boots loud on the bare wood. The loft was little more than an attic, the space tight under the angled roof, but a single, large window was set into the front-facing wall, overlooking Main Street. The dust motes danced like tiny fairies in the light pouring through it. She stood before it, looking down at the town. "I can see everything from here," she said. "I can see who is coming and going. I can see when the stage arrives." She turned to him, a determined glint in her green eyes. "This will be more than storage. Mr. Cooper, this will be my home." He started to object, to point out the lack of amenities, the rough-hewn nature of the space. But the look on her face stopped him. She was not asking for permission. She was stating a fact. This was a woman who could turn a dusty attic into a sanctuary. Back downstairs, she ran a hand along the countertop, leaving a clean streak in the grime. "We will need to draw up a lease agreement. And I insist on paying a fair price, a high price, even—" "That is not necessary," he began. "We can agree on a reasonable rate." "No," she said, her voice firm, cutting him off. "We will agree on a rate that is anything but reasonable. It must be slightly more than this space is worth, and the first 3 months' payment will be made in advance, at the bank, with Mr. Hartley as our witness. I will not have it said that I am living on your charity. I am your tenant, Mr. Cooper, nothing more." He understood immediately. Every part of their arrangement had to be unimpeachable, conducted in the full light of day where all of Pine Creek could see. She was building a fortress of respectability, and the rent was the first stone in the wall. Later that morning, Henderson and his boy delivered her 3 trunks. Daniel helped carry them into the shop, the weight of them surprising him. The 2 larger ones were filled with bolts of fabric, an astonishing collection of wools, cottons, and even a few silks that seemed out of place in this rugged land. The 3rd, longer trunk held her sewing machine, a black iron marvel of engineering that she treated with the care a gunsmith gives his finest rifle. As they set the last trunk down, she looked at his hands. "Those are not the calluses of a Montana rancher," she observed quietly. He instinctively curled his fingers into his palm. She was right. The deepest marks on his hands were older, worn into a different pattern from years of handling a different kind of rope, under a hotter sun. "You have a keen eye, Miss Winters," he said, his voice neutral. "A dressmaker must," she replied, her gaze steady. "A misplaced seam can ruin the line of a skirt. A misplaced detail can tell the wrong story about a person." The message was clear. She had her secrets, and she assumed he had his. They would respect that boundary. They spent the day cleaning. Evelyn worked with a focused, tireless energy that shamed him. She seemed to know exactly what she wanted, directing him to scrub the floors while she herself washed the windows until they sparkled, letting the full force of the sunlight flood the room. As she worked, a faint, pleasant scent began to fill the space, a mix of lavender and something warm and spicy that he could not name. It was the scent of her, he realized, and it was slowly replacing the stale smell of failure. Their work was punctuated by the town's curiosity. Martha Henderson, the stage driver's wife and the town's foremost gossip, made a slow pass by the shop 3 times, her neck craned. Then, in the mid-afternoon, Barbara Whitman appeared at the open door, a basket on her arm and a smile fixed on her face. "Mr. Cooper, Miss Winters, I see you are hard at work. I just wanted to properly welcome you to Pine Creek." my dear," she said, her eyes cataloging every detail of the shop and of Evelyn's practical work dress. "That is very kind of you. Mrs. Whitman?" Evelyn said, pausing to wipe a smudge of dust from her cheek. "We were all so distressed to hear about your cousin's poor health," Barbara continued, her tone dripping with sympathy. "It must have been such a difficult journey for you, coming all this way alone." "The journey was long, but I find the destination well worth the effort," Evelyn replied smoothly, giving nothing away. Daniel stepped forward, positioning himself as a buffer. "Miss Winters is a woman of great fortitude. She is opening a dressmaking establishment here. I am simply her landlord." Barbara's smile tightened a fraction. "A dressmaker. How wonderful. We are in desperate need of some refinement. I will have to be your first customer." It was both a promise and a threat. An order from the mayor's wife would be a stamp of approval, but it would also be an inspection of the highest order. When she was gone, Daniel let out a breath he did not realize he was holding. "You handled that well." Evelyn was already back to her work. She was measuring me for a social coffin. "Mr. Cooper, I have no intention of lying down in it." True to his word, he walked her to the bank. Mr. Hartley was a shrewd, cautious man, but he was also a businessman. When Daniel introduced Evelyn as his new business associate, and she produced a pouch of gold eagles to pay her rent and open an account, Hartley's caution turned to respect. The transaction was recorded, witnessed, and official. The foundation of her fortress was now secure. The town meeting was that Friday. The whole of Pine Creek crowded into the town hall, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and anticipation. The main topic was the railroad spur that was finally, after years of petitions, going to be built to their town. It meant growth, change, and money. Daniel sat with Evelyn near the back. It was her first official appearance in town society, and he could feel the eyes on them. He kept his expression impassive, a calm facade over the strange unease churning in his gut. This was his world, the world of ranchers and merchants, of practical men discussing practical things. She did not belong here, and yet she seemed utterly unfazed. Mayor Whitman spoke of land grants and contracts. Jake Morrison asked about freight rates for iron. The discussion was heated but productive. Then Daniel stood. He had a question about grazing rights near the proposed track line, a concern shared by the other ranchers. He spoke clearly and concisely, and when he was done, he did not sit down immediately. "Mr. Mayor," he said, his voice carrying through the hall, "before I conclude, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce a new member of our business community." Every head turned. "This is Miss Evelyn Winters. She has taken the lease on my property on Main Street and will be opening a fine dressmaking shop. I believe her enterprise will be a valuable addition to Pine Creek." He called her a business associate, a tenant, an entrepreneur. He used every word he could think of to define their relationship in terms of commerce, not scandal. He sat down to a polite smattering of applause. Then Barbara Whitman's clear, sharp voice cut through the room. "How wonderful to have such skills in our town. Miss Winters," she said, standing so all could see her. "Tell us, where did you practice your trade before gracing us with your presence? Did you have a large clientele back in Ohio?" The room went silent. It was a direct challenge, a public demand for her history, a simple question designed to uncover any crack in her story. Evelyn rose to her feet with a quiet grace that drew every eye. She did not look flustered. She looked confident, poised. "A seamstress needs only a few things to build a clientele. Mrs. Whitman," Evelyn said, her voice calm and pleasant, yet carrying to every corner of the room a steady hand, a true eye for color, and good light. "And I must say," she added, turning her head to look around at the women in the room, "I see so much potential in Pine Creek. I see women who work hard, who ride and ranch and build this town alongside their men. Such women deserve clothing that is as strong and as beautiful as they are. Dresses that allow for movement but still possess an elegant line. A well-made garment, ladies, is not a frivolous luxury. It is a suit of armor for the everyday battles of life. A murmur of approval went through the crowd. Sarah Morrison nodded enthusiastically. My shop, Evelyn's Fine Dressmaking, will open in 2 weeks' time, she concluded, her eyes finally settling back on Barbara Whitman with a small, polite smile. I would be honored, Mrs. Whitman, if you would allow me to make you my first creation, a dress befitting the first lady of a town on the verge of greatness. She had not only deflected the question, she had turned it into an advertisement, flattered her inquisitor, and declared her ambition all in one breath. Barbara Whitman, momentarily speechless, could do nothing but sit down. In the ensuing noise, Sarah Morrison leaned across the aisle. Put my name down after Mrs. Whitman's, she said, her voice full of admiration. 2 other women echoed her. Evelyn had won the first battle. That night, the shop was quiet. A single lamp cast a warm glow over the chaos of her unpacking. Bolts of fabric were now stacked on newly built shelves, their colors of vibrant promise against the plain wood walls. The black iron sewing machine sat on a small table, a sentinel awaiting its duties. They were both exhausted. Daniel had brought a pot of coffee from the hotel, and they sat in the small back room, the rich aroma filling the silence. He had done what he promised. He had given her a foothold, but he felt a strange reluctance to leave. The quiet in this room was different from the quiet at his ranch. His was an empty quiet. This was a quiet filled with potential, with the silent hum of a future being stitched together. He watched her hands as she cradled her coffee cup. They were strong, capable hands, now smudged with dirt and paint, but graceful all the same. She had faced down the entire town and had not flinched. He had wanted a wife who was calm and gentle. Instead, fate had brought him a partner in a deal of honor, a woman with the spirit of a general and the eye of an artist. You were good tonight, he said into the comfortable darkness. She looked up, her green eyes reflecting the lamplight. I was honest, she replied. It is often the most effective strategy. They sat for a long while, not speaking, just sharing the coffee and the quiet. The distance between them was proper and clear. The distance between a landlord and a tenant, between 2 associates in a deal, but in the warm, lavender-scented darkness. Daniel felt the edges of that distance begin to soften, like a starched collar after a long, hard day. 2 weeks of relentless work had transformed the dusty shell on Main Street into a beacon of color and order. The sign above the door, painted in elegant gold script, now read Evelyn's Fine Dressmaking. Inside, bolts of fabric were arranged like a painter's palette, and the great front window displayed her first triumph, a deep blue traveling suit for Barbara Whitman, tailored with such precision that it made the mayor's wife look 10 years younger and 2 inches taller. The commission had been a test, and Evelyn had passed with flying colors. Orders followed, first as a trickle, then as a steady stream. The women of Pine Creek, starved for a touch of beauty and refinement, flocked to her shop. Daniel found himself making excuses to ride into town more often than was strictly necessary. He would tie his horse outside the smithy to talk stock with Jake Morrison, but his eyes would invariably drift to the dress shop. He would see Evelyn inside, her red hair a splash of fire against the cool fabrics, her head bent in concentration as she measured a shoulder or pinned a hem. They maintained their professional distance, their conversations limited to polite inquiries about business or the weather. But an unspoken current flowed between them. He was her landlord. She was his tenant. But they were also allies, bound by the strange circumstances of her arrival. He had expected his life to become quieter with the prospect of marriage. Instead, it had become infinitely more interesting. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. The stagecoach arrived, as it always did, in a cloud of dust and a jangle of harness. But this time, the man who stepped out was different. He was not a weary traveler or a hopeful prospector. He was tall and slender, dressed in a tailored Eastern suit of charcoal gray that seemed entirely out of place in the rugged town. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and he moved with an air of innate superiority, as if the entire world were his private drawing room. He paused on the boardwalk, his cool gray eyes scanning the street, a flicker of distaste crossing his features. Daniel was at the mercantile, settling his account, when he saw the stranger ask Henderson a question. The driver pointed a thumb toward Evelyn's shop. A cold knot formed in Daniel's stomach. He watched the man cross the street, his walk a study in arrogance, and enter the dress shop without a moment's hesitation. Inside, Evelyn was fitting Sarah Morrison for a new church dress. She was on her knees, her mouth full of pins, adjusting the hem. The little bell above the door jingled, and she looked up, a smile ready for a new customer. The smile froze on her face. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her freckles standing out in stark relief. "William," she said, her voice a choked whisper. The man, William Thornton, smiled, a thin, unpleasant curving of his lips. It did not reach his predatory eyes. "Evelyn, my dear, what an elaborate game of hide-and-seek you have been playing. Did you truly think I would not find you in this desolate corner of the world?" Sarah Morrison looked back and forth between them, her eyes wide with alarm. She took a step back, sensing the dangerous tension that had suddenly filled the small shop. "What are you doing here?" Evelyn asked, slowly rising to her feet. She had removed the pins from her mouth, and her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. "I have come to take you home." "Of course," William said, as if speaking to a difficult child. "This little adventure of yours has gone on long enough." He took a step closer, his gaze sweeping the shop with disdain. "A dressmaker? How quaint. Have you tired of playing shopkeeper yet?" It was then that Daniel walked in. He had seen the look on Evelyn's face through the window and had not thought twice. He simply moved, his body acting on an instinct he did not bother to question. He closed the door behind him, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. William Thornton turned, raising a single, questioning eyebrow. "And who might this be?" "I am her landlord," Daniel said, his voice level and cold. "And you are trespassing on private property." William let out a short, humorless laugh. "The landlord. I see. You must be Mr. Cooper. Evelyn mentioned you in one of her more fanciful letters." "Do not concern yourself. My good man, this is a private family matter." "It stopped being a private matter when you walked through that door," Daniel said, moving to stand slightly in front of Evelyn, creating a shield with his body. He was not as tall as Thornton, but he was broader, harder. He was a man shaped by the land, while William was a man shaped by tailors and society. "Sarah," Evelyn said, her voice trembling but firm, "perhaps we can finish this fitting another time." Sarah Morrison needed no further encouragement. She practically fled the shop, leaving the three of them locked in a standoff. "Now," William said, his voice turning icy. "Evelyn, you will pack your things. We are leaving on the morning stage." "I am not going anywhere with you," she shot back, her spirit returning. "I have a business here, a life." "You have a fantasy," William corrected her. "One that I am here to end. You are my fiancé. We have a contract." He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, signed and witnessed. "You belong with me." "That contract was signed under duress," Evelyn said, her voice rising. "A legal document is a legal document," William said smoothly. "It will be recognized in any civilized court, and just in case your delicate sensibilities have become overwrought by this rustic environment, I have also taken the liberty of bringing this." He produced a second letter, a signed statement from Dr. Alastair Finch, confirming your fragile nervous condition and the necessity of my guardianship for your own well-being. The mention of the doctor's name was like a key turning in a lock. releasing a terror in Evelyn that Daniel had never seen before. Her face went ashen, and for a moment, he thought she might faint. The steel in her spine seemed to dissolve. This was the source of the shadow in her past, the secret she had guarded so carefully. "You would not," she whispered, her voice full of a horror that chilled Daniel to the bone. "I would, and I have," William said, his victory apparent in his smug smile. "You will come home with me, Evelyn, or I will have you committed to a place where you will be cared for properly. A sanatorium. For your own good, of course." Daniel had heard enough. He took a deliberate step forward. "I think it is time for you to leave," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. William scoffed. "Do not interfere in things you do not understand, cowboy. I understand that you are threatening a woman in my town, in my building." Daniel's hand moved, not toward the Colt revolver holstered at his hip, but to rest on the doorframe, blocking the exit. He looked at William, his gaze flat and hard as Montana granite. "This isn't the East. Thornton, we do not settle our differences with scented letters and lawyers. We bury our troublemakers." The threat hung in the air, simple, direct, and utterly believable. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty appeared in William's cold eyes. He was a man used to fighting his battles in courtrooms and parlors, with weapons of paper and social pressure. He was not prepared for this. But it was Evelyn who delivered the final blow. The fear in her eyes was being burned away by a rising, righteous anger. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer a whisper. It rang with the clarity of a bell. "He is lying," she cried, pointing a trembling finger at William. "That doctor is a fraud. William tried to have me put away before I left. He paid Dr. Finch to write a false diagnosis. To claim my independence was a sign of female hysteria. All so he could gain control of my inheritance. He wanted to lock me away and steal my life." The ugly truth of it hung in the air, more damning than any weapon. The whole sordid story was there in her impassioned words, in the venomous look on William's face. That was all Daniel needed to hear. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance between them. He did not draw his gun. He did something far more personal. He grabbed the front of William's expensive coat, bunching the fine fabric in his fist, and propelled him backward, out of the shop and onto the boardwalk. William stumbled, his polished shoes slipping on the dusty wood, his face a mask of shock and outrage. Daniel followed him out, his presence a dark and menacing promise. He stood over the man from the east, his shadow falling across him. The sounds of the street had died away. Jake Morrison had come to the door of his smithy, a hammer in his hand. Mayor Whitman was watching from the window of the land office. A small crowd was gathering. Daniel's hand finally went to his Colt. He did not draw it fully, but merely rested his hand on the worn wooden grip, a gesture that was more potent than any overt threat. "The next stagecoach leaves in the morning," Daniel said, his voice low and carrying in the silence. "Be on it. If I ever see your face in Pine Creek again, I will not be so courteous." William Thornton scrambled to his feet, trying to regain some semblance of his dignity. He brushed at his coat, his face flushed with fury and humiliation. He looked at Daniel, then at the hard, watching faces of the townspeople. He saw no allies here. This was not his world. He had no power here. He shot one last look of pure hatred at Evelyn, who now stood in the doorway of her shop, pale but defiant. Then, without another word, he turned and stalked off toward the hotel. A defeated general retreating from a battle he had never been equipped to fight. Daniel stood watching until William disappeared inside the hotel. He could feel the eyes of the town on him. He turned and looked at Evelyn. She was shaking, her body trembling with the aftermath of the confrontation. He went to her, his anger replaced by a deep, protective instinct he had never felt for anyone before. He led her back into the shop and closed the door, shutting out the curious eyes of the world. He guided her to a small chair in the back room and then put a kettle on the small stove she kept there. He did not know what else to do. He moved with a sense of purpose, making coffee, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in the storm. When he handed her a cup, her hands were still shaking so much that the cup rattled in its saucer. He knelt in front of her and gently took the cup from her, placing it on a nearby table. He then took her cold hands in his own. "It is over," he said softly. "He is gone." She looked at him, her beautiful green eyes filled with tears. "He will be back," she whispered. "If he comes back, we will be ready for him," he said, the word "we" feeling as natural as breathing. He looked at her, this brave, complicated woman who had turned his world upside down. He had wanted a quiet, simple life, a gentle wife to share it with. But as he knelt there on the floor of her shop, holding her hands, he knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that he did not want quiet anymore. He wanted the fire he had seen in her voice, the strength he had seen in her eyes. He wanted her. The realization was as terrifying as it was undeniable. Their deal of honor had become something more, something deeper. He was no longer just her landlord. He was her ally, her protector, and God help him, he was falling in love with her. The weeks following William Thornton's departure settled into a tense, watchful quiet. He had left on the morning stage as ordered, a thundercloud of a man whose silent fury promised he was not finished. The town, having witnessed the confrontation, had closed ranks around Evelyn. Sarah Morrison had been discreet, but the core of the story had spread like wildfire through dry grass. The townspeople did not know the details of her past, but they knew she had been threatened, and they knew Daniel Cooper had stood for her. In the unwritten code of the West, that was enough. A person's worth was measured by their actions and their allies. And Evelyn had proven her mettle and found a formidable one in Daniel. Life took on a new rhythm. Daniel continued his visits to town, his conversations with Evelyn still framed by the wooden counter of her shop, but the space between them now held a different charge. The polite distance of their business arrangement was now overlaid with a shared history, a shared danger. He saw the way she looked toward the street whenever the stagecoach was due, the slight tensing of her shoulders that she tried so hard to hide. He found himself wanting to erase that fear, to stand as a permanent bulwark between her and the shadows of her past. The sky was a vast, indifferent blue the day the fire broke out. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting low and casting long shadows across Main Street. A sudden, frantic clanging of a bell shattered the peace. Not the church bell calling for Sunday service, but the urgent, desperate clang of the fire alarm from atop the town hall. Shouts erupted. People poured out of the shops and houses, their faces turning toward the thick, black pillar of smoke billowing into the sky from the edge of town. "It is Henderson's place," a man yelled. "Running past, the barn is going up." Daniel was leaving the mercantile. He dropped the sack of flour he was carrying and broke into a run, his mind racing. Henderson's barn was full of hay from the summer cutting, dry as tinder, and his horses, his prized team of Percherons, would be in their stalls. He reached the Henderson property at the same time as Jake Morrison and a dozen other men. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall that pushed them back. Flames licked out of the hayloft, a roaring, hungry beast consuming the dry timbers of the barn. Martha Henderson was in the yard, her face streaked with tears and soot, her husband trying to hold her back. The horses, she screamed. He could not get them out. Through the wide-open barn doors, Daniel could see the terrified animals, their eyes white with panic, rearing and kicking against their stalls as sparks and burning embers rained down around them. The main support beam overhead was groaning, smoke pouring from it. There was not much time. Without a second thought, Daniel ran to the water trough. He grabbed a heavy horse blanket from a fence rail, plunged it into the water until it was soaked and heavy, and then wrapped it around his head and shoulders. "Daniel!" "No," Jake shouted, grabbing his arm. "It is suicide. She is about to come down." Daniel shook him off. "They will be cooked alive," he yelled over the roar of the fire, his voice muffled by the wet wool. And then he ran, a dark, hunched figure disappearing into the inferno. Evelyn had seen the smoke from her shop window. Her heart had seized in her chest with a cold, terrifying certainty. Daniel was in town. He would be there. She grabbed her medical kit, a small bag she always kept stocked with bandages and salves, and ran toward the fire, her skirts flying, her carefully composed world dissolving into smoke and fear. She arrived to see the crowd staring in horror at the blazing barn. "Where is he?" she cried, grabbing Sarah Morrison's arm. "Where is Daniel?" Sarah pointed a trembling finger toward the barn. "He went in," she whispered, "for the horses." Time seemed to stop. Evelyn could not breathe. She could only stare at the monstrous, fiery maw of the barn, the place that had swallowed him whole. A collective gasp went through the crowd as a section of the roof collapsed inward, sending a geyser of sparks and flames shooting toward the sky. Then, just as despair began to take hold, a figure staggered out of the smoke. It was Daniel, his clothes smoking, his face black with soot. He was half dragging, half leading one of the massive horses, which was snorting in terror but followed him blindly. He got the animal clear and slapped its rump, sending it galloping into the nearby pasture. Then he turned and, to everyone's disbelief, plunged back into the barn. A moment later, he emerged with a second horse. As the animal galloped to safety, the great overhead beam finally gave way, crashing down in a shower of fire and splintered wood, sealing the entrance. Daniel was clear by mere inches. He stood for a moment, swaying on his feet, his chest heaving with great, rasping coughs that tore through his smoke-ravaged lungs. Then his legs buckled, and he collapsed to the ground. Evelyn was the first to reach him. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands hovering over him, afraid to touch. The wet blanket had saved him from the worst of the flames, but his left arm, which had been exposed, was a raw, angry red. The sleeve of his shirt burned away. He was coughing uncontrollably, each breath a painful, wheezing struggle. "You fool," she breathed, the words a mixture of fury and overwhelming relief. She smoothed the hair back from his soot-stained forehead. "You magnificent, insane fool, are you insane?" He opened his eyes, his gaze unfocused. He tried to speak, but it came out as another racking cough. Dr. Watson pushed his way through the crowd, his black bag in his hand. He knelt and made a quick, efficient examination. "He has inhaled a great deal of smoke," the doctor announced, his voice grave. "And this burn needs tending. We need to get him somewhere he can rest and be watched. The smoke is the real danger. His lungs need to be kept clear." "Take him to my ranch," Daniel rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I will take him," Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the noise. It was not a request. It was a command. She looked at Jake Morrison. "Your wagon. Now." No one argued. The town had just witnessed an act of incredible bravery. They had also just witnessed the moment a business arrangement became something else entirely. Jake and another man gently lifted Daniel into the back of the wagon. Evelyn climbed in beside him, cradling his head in her lap as they began the slow, bumpy ride out of town. The silence of his ranch house was a world away from the chaos of the fire. With Jake's help, she got him into his bed. The house was clean and orderly, but it felt empty, a place that was lived in but not loved. It was a house waiting for a heart. Dr. Watson arrived a short time later, cleaned and bandaged the burn on Daniel's arm, and left a bitter-smelling poultice for his chest and a bottle of laudanum for the pain. "Keep him warm. Make him drink as much water as he can, and watch his breathing. If it gets any shallower, send for me immediately," he instructed before he left. And then they were alone. The sun had set, and a deep twilight settled over the valley. Evelyn lit a single lamp, casting a soft, golden glow over the room. Daniel had drifted into a fitful, feverish sleep. His breathing was a harsh, rattling sound in the profound quiet. She sat in a straight-backed chair beside his bed, a sentinel on duty. She found a basin and a cloth and gently washed the soot from his face, revealing the sharp, handsome lines of his jaw, the faint white scar above his eyebrow. She tended to him with a quiet efficiency, her dressmaker's hands proving to be as adept at healing as they were at sewing. She brewed a strong herbal tea and, whenever he stirred, she would lift his head and help him sip the warm liquid. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, he began to cough again, a deep, painful spasm that shook his entire body. His eyes flew open, clouded with pain and confusion. He looked at her, his gaze struggling to focus. "Evelyn?" he whispered, the name a rough, unfamiliar sound on his tongue. It was the first time he had called her that. "I am here, Daniel," she answered softly, her own use of his first name a natural, inevitable response. She took his hand, the one that was not burned. His skin was hot and dry, but his grip was surprisingly strong. "You are safe." He closed his eyes again, but he did not let go of her hand. She sat there, holding on to him, the silent contact a conversation far more profound than any words. In that moment, she was not just a tenant or a business associate. She was his anchor, and for her, a woman who had spent months feeling adrift and in danger. His hand in hers was a harbor. In the quiet darkness of his room, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, Evelyn Winters felt a sense of safety that she thought had been stolen from her forever. He was a good man, a brave man, a man who ran into a fire to save a helpless animal. He had faced down her past and had not flinched. He had offered her a deal of honor and had stood by it, asking nothing in return. He had given her a chance to build a new life, and now, he had almost lost his own for the sake of his neighbors. A wave of emotion so powerful, it almost buckled her, washed over Evelyn. It was more than gratitude, more than admiration. It was a fierce, protective tenderness that ached in her chest. She looked at his sleeping face, at the lines of pain etched around his mouth, at the ugly red burn on his arm, the price of his courage. He stirred again, murmuring something she could not understand. She leaned closer, her hand still holding his, her other hand coming up to gently brush his hair from his forehead. The house was silent except for the rasp of his breathing and the frantic beating of her own heart. "I care for you, Daniel," she whispered into the stillness, the admission more for herself than for him. The words felt both terrifying and liberating. "More than I should." He did not stir. He might not have heard, but the words were out, spoken into the lamplit intimacy of the room. A fragile seed planted in the ashes of a fire, a promise of a new kind of warmth that had nothing to do with flames. She settled back into her chair, her hand still holding his, prepared to watch over him until the dawn. The healing was a slow, quiet process. Daniel's lungs, seared by the smoke, gradually learned to draw a full breath without a painful, rattling cough. His burned arm, swathed in clean bandages that Evelyn changed daily, began to mend, the raw anger of the wound softening into a dull ache. But the most profound healing was not physical. In the quiet days and long, lamp-lit nights at the ranch, the unspoken space between them filled with a comfortable intimacy. She read to him from a worn copy of Shakespeare she had brought in one of her trunks, her voice a low, steady melody against the whisper of the prairie wind outside. He told her stories of his life, not the carefully edited version for a prospective bride, but the real one of his youth in Texas, of the trail drives that had hardened his hands and settled a certain weariness in his soul, of the deep-seated longing for a home that had finally brought him to Montana. He learned the rhythm of her presence, the soft scent of lavender and spice that clung to her, the determined set of her jaw when she was concentrating, the way her green eyes would light up with a private amusement at some thought. She had taken over his kitchen, producing simple, nourishing meals with a competence that surprised him. She had even taken to mending his work shirts, her needle moving with a swift, practiced grace that was mesmerizing to watch. Their hands would brush as she handed him a cup of coffee, and the brief contact would send a jolt through him, a current of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the woman who had doused its aftermath in his life. He was no longer her landlord. She was no longer his tenant. They were two people in a quiet house, learning the language of each other's silence. The peace was a fragile thing, and they both knew it. One afternoon, they were sitting on the porch, Daniel finally strong enough to be out of bed, when they saw a rider coming fast from the direction of town. It was Jake Morrison, his horse kicking up a plume of red dust. He pulled up short in the yard, his face grim. "Daniel," he said, dismounting without preamble. "He is back." Neither of them had to ask who. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, settled in Evelyn's stomach. "The noon stage," Jake went on, his eyes on Evelyn now. "He is not alone this time. He has a lawyer with him, a slick-looking fellow from Cheyenne, and two other men who look like they get paid to stand around looking mean." Daniel slowly got to his feet, his hand instinctively going to his bandaged arm. He was not fully healed, not by a long shot, but a cold, hard resolve settled over his features. "Where are they?" "The hotel. Thornton booked 3 rooms and has been holding court in the lobby, telling anyone who will listen that he is here to reclaim his runaway fiancée and protect her from her own fragile mind." Evelyn stood up, her back ramrod straight. The fear was there, a cold knot inside her, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, burning anger. She had worked too hard, had come too far, to be dragged back into the darkness. She went inside the house without a word. When she returned, she was wearing her emerald green dress, the one she had arrived in, her armor, in her hand. She carried a slim portfolio tied with a simple ribbon. "He has his paper weapons," she said, her voice steady, "the fire back in its depths. I have mine." Daniel looked at her, at the raw courage in her face, and his heart ached with a feeling so powerful it almost stole his breath. He went to the stable and saddled his horse in the gentle mare she had ridden from town. "Jake," he said, "ride ahead. Tell the mayor. Tell anyone you think ought to know. We will be right behind you." The lobby of the Pine Creek Hotel felt like a theater set for a grim play. William Thornton stood in the center of the worn Turkish rug, flanked by his lawyer, a man with a thin mustache and reptilian eyes, and 2 large, silent men in dusty trail coats, their hands never straying far from the pistols holstered at their hips. A small crowd of townspeople, including Mayor Whitman and a nervous-looking Mr. Hartley from the bank, lined the walls, silent and watchful. The doors opened, and Daniel and Evelyn walked in. A hush fell over the room. Daniel's arm was in a sling, but he stood tall, his presence filling the space beside her. Evelyn walked to the center of the room, stopping a few feet from William, her gaze unwavering. "William," she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room. "This has to end." William gave her that thin, cruel smile. "I quite agree. My dear, it ends today. You will be coming with me. This time, there will be no discussion." He gestured to his lawyer. The lawyer stepped forward, clearing his throat. "We have here," he began, holding up a sheaf of papers, "a legally binding betrothal contract. We also have a signed affidavit from a respected physician attesting to Miss Winter's delicate mental state and the necessity of Mr. Thornton's guardianship. We are fully prepared to enforce Mr. Thornton's legal rights, with the assistance of the territorial authorities if necessary." "You mean with the assistance of these 2 thugs?" Daniel said, his voice a low growl. The lawyer ignored him. "This is a simple matter of law." "No," Evelyn said, her voice ringing with authority. "This is a simple matter of truth." She untied the ribbon on her portfolio and took out a letter. "This is a statement from a man named Dr. Michael Reed, a physician of impeccable reputation in Philadelphia. He examined me at my request. The day before I left, he found me to be, and I quote, of sound mind and body, and suffering from no malady other than the severe distress caused by the unwanted and coercive attentions of Mr. William Thornton. A murmur went through the crowd. William's smile faltered. "And this," she continued, producing another paper, "is a sworn statement from my former maid, Mary O'Connell. In it, she details the afternoon you brought your paid physician, Dr. Finch, to my house, and how she overheard you instructing him on exactly what his diagnosis should be." The lawyer's reptilian eyes widened slightly. "These documents are of questionable origin," he started to bluster. "Are they?" Evelyn countered, her voice like ice. "Perhaps this one will be less questionable." She held up the final letter. "This is a letter from your own mother, William. She wrote it to me in confidence, expressing her deep concern over your gambling debts and your desperate attempts to gain control of my trust fund, which she reminds me here you cannot touch until we are married. She begs me to reconsider our engagement, for my own safety." It was a mortal blow. William's face, already pale, turned a mottled, furious red. All his legal posturing, all his claims of concern for her welfare, had been stripped away, revealing the greedy, grasping truth beneath. He was exposed, humiliated in front of an entire town. He lost control. With a strangled cry of rage, he lunged for her, his hands outstretched as if to seize the letters, to seize her. "You!" he snarled. He never reached her. Daniel, moving with a speed that belied his injury, stepped in front of her. His good right fist shot out, connecting with William's jaw with a sickening crack. William staggered backward, his eyes wide with shock, and collapsed in a heap on the Turkish rug, utterly defeated. The two hired gunslingers instinctively moved forward, their hands dropping to their pistols, but they stopped dead. A series of quiet, metallic clicks echoed in the silent room. Jake Morrison stood near the door, his smithing hammer replaced by an old but reliable Colt. Mayor Whitman had a small derringer in his hand. From around the room, 4, then 5 other men, simple merchants and ranchers, had drawn their own weapons. They did not aim them. They did not have to. They just held them, a silent, unified wall of frontier justice. The town had chosen its side. The Cheyenne lawyer looked at the silent, armed men, then at his client on the floor, and made a swift calculation. He raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "There has been a misunderstanding," he said, his voice suddenly slick with conciliation. "My client was overwrought. We will withdraw our petition." He and the 2 gunmen hauled the groaning William to his feet and half-dragged him out the door. In the sudden, profound quiet, Daniel and Evelyn were left standing alone in the center of the lobby. The townspeople began to melt away, giving them their privacy, their quiet approval hanging in the air. Evelyn was shaking, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving her weak. Daniel turned to her, his own heart pounding. He looked at her, so fierce and fragile and beautiful, standing there in her emerald dress, the woman who had faced down her own demons and won. "Evelyn," he began, his voice rough with emotion. She looked up at him, her green eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I love you, Daniel," she whispered, the words tumbling out, raw and honest. All the carefully constructed walls around his heart crumbled to dust. He had wanted a quiet life, a peaceful existence. He had been a fool. Quiet was loneliness. Peace was emptiness. What he wanted was this fire, this strength, this woman. "I want your fire, Evelyn," he said, his voice thick. "I want all of it, just as you are." He cupped her face with his good hand and he kissed her. It was not a gentle, tentative kiss. It was a kiss of profound relief, of fierce claiming, a public declaration of everything that had passed between them in silent looks and shared moments. It was the sealing of a bond forged in scandal, tested by fire, and proven in conflict. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathless. He looked down into her eyes. and he saw his own future reflected there, a future that was anything but quiet. "Marry me, Evelyn," he said, his voice a low, earnest plea. "I am asking for a marriage that is not silent. I am asking for a life with you." Her answer was a tearful, radiant smile that outshone the dusty afternoon light slanting through the hotel windows. Their public declaration did not go unnoticed. 2 days later, a delegation of 3 women, led by a stern-faced Barbara Whitman, arrived at the ranch in the mayor's buggy. They called themselves the Pine Creek Committee for Moral Standards. Daniel and Evelyn met them on the porch. "Mr. Cooper," Barbara began, dispensing with pleasantries, "the town is buzzing. It is highly improper for an unmarried woman to be residing here with you, under your roof, unchaperoned. Evelyn has been nursing me back to health after I was injured saving a neighbor's property," Daniel stated calmly. "An act of Christian charity. I believe it is called—" "And this public display in the hotel," Barbara pressed on, her lips pursed. "That," Daniel said, putting his arm around Evelyn's shoulders and drawing her close, "was a proposal of marriage, which she has accepted." The 3 women were momentarily stunned into silence. "We feel it is our duty as a community," Evelyn added, her voice gracious but firm, "to set a proper example, which is why we will be married in 3 weeks' time. You will all receive an invitation. Of course, I do hope you will be able to attend." She had outmaneuvered them completely, turning their moral inquisition into a social announcement. Barbara Whitman's face was a study in frustrated propriety. She could do nothing but offer a stiff congratulation and lead her committee in a swift retreat. As the buggy rattled away down the lane, Daniel looked at Evelyn, a slow smile spreading across his face. He had asked for a life that was not quiet, and it seemed his wish had already been granted. The 3 weeks leading up to the wedding were a whirlwind of quiet activity and shared purpose. Evelyn, having handed off the final stitches of her last commission, temporarily closed her shop. She spent her days at the ranch, turning Daniel's starkly masculine house into a home. Curtains, sewn from a cheerful yellow cotton, appeared in the windows. An embroidered runner graced the long dining table. The scent of baking bread began to compete with the familiar smells of leather and wood smoke. For his part, Daniel worked on the house with a renewed energy, repairing a loose shutter, building a new bookshelf for her books. His movements filled with the quiet joy of a man building a life, not just a ranch. The town watched them with a mixture of curiosity and genuine affection. The initial scandal of Evelyn's arrival had been burned away by the fires of adversity, leaving behind a story of courage and loyalty that the people of Pine Creek could understand and respect. They had seen Daniel Cooper stand for this woman, and they had seen her stand by him. They were a good match. The whispers of the Moral Standards Committee had faded into the background, replaced by the friendly advice of Sarah Morrison on the best cut of beef for a wedding feast and the gruff congratulations of Jake, who was forging a simple, elegant pair of iron candlesticks as a wedding gift. A sense of hope, as fragile and as beautiful as a prairie wildflower, had taken root in the dusty soil of Pine Creek. The disaster struck on a Thursday, a week before the wedding. A low, guttural rumble, more felt than heard, shook the valley. It was a sound unlike the familiar thunder that rolled down from the mountains. Daniel was in the corral, working with a young colt, and he felt the vibration through the soles of his boots. He looked up toward the mountains, to the west, where the new Colton silver mine had been in operation for the last 6 months. A plume of dust, thick and brown like a dirty thumbprint, was rising against the clear blue sky. He did not wait for confirmation. He threw a saddle on his fastest horse, shouting for Evelyn to stay at the house as he galloped away. By the time he reached town, the alarm bell was already ringing its frantic, desperate peal. Men were pouring out of the saloon and the mercantile, their faces pale with a shared, terrible knowledge. The Colton mine had collapsed. There were more than 20 men underground. Chaos reigned at the mine entrance. A landslide had completely sealed the main shaft. a tangled mess of rock, dirt, and shattered timbers. Wives and children of the miners had already begun to gather, their sobs and cries a heartbreaking chorus against the frantic shouts of the foreman. Daniel took charge with a calm, steady authority that cut through the panic. "Jake," he yelled, his voice a clear command. "Get every shovel and pickaxe in town. We need a bucket brigade to clear this rock. Henderson, take your wagon. Get water barrels and lanterns. We will need light, and the men inside will need water." He organized the able-bodied men into teams, their initial, panicked efforts now focused into a desperate but methodical rescue mission. They attacked the wall of debris, their shovels biting into the loose earth, a silent, grim prayer on every man's lips. Evelyn arrived a short time later in the wagon Daniel had left behind, its bed loaded with every blanket, sheet, and bottle of whiskey she could find at the ranch. She had seen disasters before. She knew what would be needed. She found Dr. Watson already on the scene, his face a grim mask. "They will be injured," she said to him, her voice quiet and professional amidst the clamor. "Shock, broken bones, lung damage from the dust. We need a place to treat them." She did not wait for an answer. With the help of Sarah Morrison and a suddenly purposeful Barbara Whitman, she established a makeshift field hospital in the foreman's office. She directed the women to tear sheets for bandages, set water to boil for sterilization, and lay out the blankets as pallets on the floor. She moved with a focused, efficient grace, her dressmaker's shop and her wedding plans a world away. Here, in the shadow of the mountain, there was only the raw, immediate business of life and death. For hours, the men dug, their muscles straining, their faces caked with sweat and dirt. Daniel worked alongside them, his bandaged arm a dull, throbbing reminder of his own mortality. But he did not slow down. He was their leader, their anchor, and he would not falter. Late in the afternoon, they broke through, a small opening, just big enough for a man to crawl through. A faint cry for help from the darkness beyond sent a surge of renewed hope through the exhausted rescuers. One by one, they began to bring the miners out. They were battered, bruised, and choking on dust, but they were alive. Evelyn and the other women worked tirelessly, cleaning wounds, setting splints, forcing water and whiskey between cracked lips. Evelyn moved from man to man, her touch gentle, her voice a low, soothing murmur. She was bandaging a deep gash on a young miner's arm when the world suddenly tilted on its axis. The faces around her blurred, the sounds of the rescue fading into a distant roar. A wave of dizziness and nausea washed over her, and the ground seemed to rush up to meet her. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Daniel's horrified face as he rushed toward her. She awoke on a cot in the corner of the foreman's office. The air smelled of coffee and antiseptic. Dr. Watson was standing over her, a stethoscope in his hand, his expression unreadable. Daniel was beside him, his face etched with worry. "Just exhaustion," the doctor said, his voice meant to be reassuring. "She has been working like a Trojan." He helped her sit up, and she took a sip of the water Daniel offered her. "I would like to have a proper look at you back in my office. Though, Evelyn, just to be sure." Later, in the quiet of the doctor's examining room, the truth came out. He listened to her heart, took her pulse, and asked her a series of gentle questions. When had she last had her monthly courses? Had she been feeling overly tired? Had she experienced any spells of nausea? She answered him in a low voice, a cold, creeping suspicion turning into a horrifying certainty in her heart. He finished his examination and sat down in the chair opposite her, his hands folded on his desk. "Evelyn," he said, his voice full of a gentle compassion that was almost her undoing, "you are not ill. You are with child. I would say you are about 2 months along." The room went silent. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded like hammer blows. Pregnant. The word was a death sentence. The child was not Daniel's. It could not be. The timing was impossible. The baby was a product of the last Terrible night in Philadelphia. A brutal act of possession by William before she had managed to escape his grasp. It was a secret she had buried so deep she had almost convinced herself it was not real. But it was. It was growing inside her, a living reminder of her deepest shame and trauma. She felt a wave of self-loathing so profound it threatened to drown her. She was ruined, tainted, unworthy of the good, honorable man who was waiting for her outside. The man who had offered her a future she had never dreamed she could have. He had asked for her fire, not her ashes. When she walked out of the doctor's office, Daniel knew at once that something was terribly wrong. All the color had drained from her face, leaving it a pale, translucent mask of despair. The strength that he admired so much seemed to have evaporated, leaving behind a terrifying fragility. "What is it?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. What did he say? She could not speak, could not bring herself to form the words that would shatter their world. She simply shook her head and allowed him to lead her to the wagon. The ride back to the ranch was a silent torment. Every glance he gave her, full of love and worry, was like a knife in her heart. In the quiet of the ranch house, she finally broke. She stood in the center of the room they had so lovingly begun to turn into a home, and the tears she had been holding back for months finally came, in great, silent, soul-wrenching sobs. Daniel went to her, pulling her into his arms, but she resisted, pushing against his chest. "No," she choked out. "Do not touch me. You do not know. You cannot." "Cannot what?" he asked, his voice raw with confusion and hurt. "Evelyn, talk to me. Whatever it is, we will face it together." "There is no we," she said, her voice breaking. She finally looked at him, her beautiful face ravaged with a pain so deep it physically hurt him to see it. "I am pregnant. Daniel." He stared at her, the words not making sense. Then he did the simple arithmetic, the counting of months, and a profound confusion settled over him. "And the child?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, the words tasting like poison in her mouth. "Is not yours. It cannot be yours." She told him everything then, the whole ugly, humiliating story of her final days in Philadelphia, of William's final, violent attempt to control her. She spoke in a flat, dead voice, as if recounting a story that had happened to someone else, her eyes fixed on a point on the floor, unable to meet his gaze. When she was finished, a terrible silence descended upon the room. This was it. This was the moment she had been dreading. He would look at her with disgust. He would see her not as the strong, independent woman he had come to love, but as damaged goods. A ruined woman carrying another man's child, a child of violence. He would rescind his offer of marriage, and she would be alone, more alone than she had ever been in her life. He did not move for a long time. She could not bring herself to look at him, could only wait for the final, killing blow of his rejection. Then she felt him move. He stepped closer, and his arms went around her, pulling her against his chest. He held her not with passion, but with a profound, unshakable tenderness. He held her as she trembled, his hand stroking her hair. He let her cry until the storm of her grief had passed, leaving her limp and exhausted in his arms. He then tilted her chin up, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were not filled with disgust or anger. They were filled with a deep, unwavering love and a fierce, protective light. "The child is innocent," he said, his voice low and firm, each word a stone being laid in the foundation of their future. "Whatever happened, the child is innocent. Let them talk. Let them count the months. I do not care what they say." He pulled her closer, his lips brushing her forehead. "The child will have the Cooper name. Our child." The relief that washed over her was so immense. It was a physical sensation, a release of a pressure she had not even realized she had been carrying. He was not leaving her. He was shielding her. He was choosing her. All of her. The broken pieces and the dark secrets included. "We will be married tomorrow," he said, his decision absolute, At dawn, at the foot of the mountains, we will make our vows to each other, not to the town. Their wedding was not what anyone had planned. The only witnesses were the rising sun, the ancient, silent mountains, and a surprised but understanding Jake and Sarah Morrison. Evelyn wore a simple cream-colored dress she had made herself. Daniel wore his good suit. In his hand, he held a simple, unadorned gold band that he had bought from the Mercantile's small selection. They spoke their own vows as the first rays of sunlight painted the peaks in shades of rose and gold. They did not promise a life of ease or quiet. They promised to stand together, to be each other's shelter, to face whatever storms might come. United. When he slipped the simple ring on her finger, it was not just a symbol of marriage. It was a promise of protection, a circle of safety in a harsh and unforgiving world. Their wedding night was not one of fevered passion. It was a quiet, sacred ceremony of healing. In the soft lamplight of their bedroom, he gently unwrapped the bandages from his arm, and she gently applied a fresh dressing, her touch immeasurably tender. On the bed lay a beautiful, intricately stitched baby blanket she had started weeks ago. Its pattern of tiny wildflowers a testament to a hope she had not even dared to name. He touched it reverently. He held her that night, his touch full of a deep respect that honored her past and promised a new beginning. There was no demand, only a gentle offering of comfort and safety. He healed the memory of a violent, selfish act with a profound and selfless tenderness. In the safety of his arms, Evelyn Cooper, a woman who had thought herself ruined beyond repair, finally felt whole. She was home. The birth of a child in a place like Pine Creek was an event of public record, a communal investment in the future. When Evelyn's time came, 7 months after her hurried wedding at the foot of the mountains, the town held its breath. The counting of months was a silent, universal arithmetic, and whispers followed Sarah Morrison as she went to the ranch with a basket of linens, her face a mask of determined loyalty. Barbara Whitman was heard to remark at the Mercantile that some things arrive ahead of schedule, her voice laced with the sweet poison of insinuation. But when Daniel Cooper rode into town the next morning to fetch Dr. Watson, the look on his face silenced all speculation. It was not the face of a shamed or duped man. It was the face of a father, fierce with a love so profound and radiant that it defied gossip. He announced the birth of his son, James Cooper, his voice booming with a pride that left no room for questions. When he brought Evelyn and the baby home from their brief stay in town, he held the boy up for all to see, a small, blanket-wrapped bundle who would bear his name and build his legacy. The whispers died. Pine Creek had seen Daniel claim the boy as his own, and in their world, a man's word, backed by his conviction, was the final law. The years that followed were a testament to the life they built from the ashes of their separate, broken pasts. Time on the ranch was measured in the turning of seasons, in the steady rhythm of calving and branding, of haying and mending fences. The small house expanded, a new room added here, a wider porch there, growing along with their family. After James came Margaret Rose, a girl with her mother's fiery hair and a sweet, steady disposition that was all her own, named in a quiet tribute to the cousin whose illness had inadvertently set their lives in motion. Then came the twins, Samuel and Thomas, two sides of the same coin, both with Daniel's dark hair and sturdy build, one quiet and observant, the other boisterous and ever curious. They were inseparable, a whirlwind of boyish energy who, by the age of 10, were more interested in the mechanics of irrigation ditches than in any schoolbook. Finally came Sarah, a watchful, thoughtful girl with her father's quiet eyes, who seemed to absorb the world through her senses, happiest when sketching the wildflowers in her mother's garden or listening to the stories the old-timers told in town. The world outside the ranch was changing just as quickly. The railroad arrived, a snorting, steaming iron beast that stitched Pine Creek to the rest of the nation. The town boomed. The single dusty street was now flanked by new buildings of brick and freshly sawn lumber. The population doubled, then tripled, with new faces and new money pouring in. With the growth came new opportunities. Evelyn's fine dressmaking, once a small shop born of necessity, became Cooper and Associates, a thriving enterprise with 2 seamstresses hired from back east and a mail-order catalog that sent her designs to ranch wives and town ladies across the territory. She was no longer just a dressmaker. She was a businesswoman, a respected pillar of the community whose sharp mind and fair dealings were as well known as her husband's integrity. Daniel, for his part, prospered with the land. He bought up the parcels adjoining his ranch, his herds of cattle growing with his acreage. He found himself, much to his own surprise, a reluctant town father. His quiet common sense and unshakable fairness made him a natural leader, and he was eventually persuaded to take a seat on the new town council, where he spoke little but was always listened to, his words carrying the weight of a man who had earned his place through hard work and honor. Electric lights were strung along Main Street, casting a stark, modern glow that seemed magical and strange against the backdrop of the ancient, star-dusted mountains, a symbol of the New West being forged from the spirit of the old. Their children grew up in this world of change, a blend of their parents' values. They were raised to respect the land, to be honest in their dealings, and to understand that a community was a thing you built and defended, not just a place you lived. The story of their parents was a quiet legend in the family, a story of courage, of a fire in a barn, of a standoff in a hotel lobby. It was the bedrock of their identity. James was 19, a young man who wore his father's quiet strength as easily as he wore his work boots. He had Evelyn's fire in his eyes, a quick intelligence and a core of determination that was unmistakable. He was his father's right hand on the ranch, a natural horseman and a born leader of men. That fire, that inherited legacy of courage, was put to the ultimate test on a crisp autumn afternoon. The sound was sickeningly familiar, the same deep, earth-shaking groan that had preceded the Colton disaster years before. This time, the dust cloud rose from the Blackwood mine. A newer, deeper shaft sunk into the opposite side of the valley. The alarm bell began its frantic, desperate song, a sound that sent a chill through the soul of anyone who remembered the last time. Daniel and James rode to the scene together. The collapse was worse than the last one. The entrance a chaotic jumble of rock and twisted support beams. A dozen men were trapped deep inside. Daniel, now in his 50s, began organizing the rescue effort with his customary calm, his voice a beacon of order in the rising panic. But he was no longer a young man who could wrap himself in a wet blanket and charge into the flames. His body ached, and his lungs remembered the smoke of Henderson's barn. It was James who stepped forward. He had been studying the mine schematics with the foreman, his young face grim and focused. "There is a ventilation shaft," he said, his voice clear and strong, cutting through the noise. "It is narrow and probably unstable, but it might still be open. It is the only way to get to them quickly." "It is too dangerous," Daniel said, his father's heart at war with his rancher's pragmatism. "We dig, it is slower, but it is safer. They do not have that much time." "Pa," James replied, his gaze meeting his father's. In that look, Daniel saw the man his son had become, a reflection of his own younger self, but with Evelyn's unwavering resolve. "I am going in." He did not wait for permission. He gathered a small team of the youngest, leanest miners, and they disappeared into the narrow, dark opening of the ventilation shaft, a thin rope their only lifeline to the world above. For Evelyn, who had arrived with the other women to set up another grim, makeshift hospital. The next 2 hours were the longest of her life. She had watched her husband run into a fire. Now she watched as the earth itself threatened to swallow her son. She stood beside Daniel, her hand gripping his arm, their shared terror a silent, terrible bond. Then, a cry from the main shaft. The digging crew had broken through to a small pocket, and minutes later, James and his team emerged from the darkness, supporting the first of the trapped miners. They had made it. He was safe. He was covered in dirt and grime, his face pale with exhaustion. But he was alive, and he was a hero. He had taken the fire his parents had kindled and carried it into the darkness, proving that the best parts of them had been passed on, a legacy more valuable than any land or money. In the aftermath of the rescue, a sense of quiet pride settled over the Cooper family. But the world has a way of testing even the strongest foundations. A week later, a letter arrived. It was postmarked from Philadelphia. The elegant, unfamiliar script on the envelope a harbinger of trouble. It was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Daniel Cooper. They read it together in the quiet of their living room, the room that had seen so much of their life unfold. The letter was from a law firm, writing on behalf of Mrs. Eleanor Thornton, the widow of the late William Thornton. William had died a year prior, leaving behind a tangled mess of debts and a dwindling fortune. The letter was polite, formal, and utterly venomous. It stated that Mrs. Thornton had recently come into possession of evidence letters and journals belonging to her late husband, suggesting that a young man named James Cooper of Pine Creek, Montana, was in fact the biological son and heir of William Thornton. The letter concluded with a thinly veiled threat. Mrs. Thornton was prepared to file a legal claim on behalf of her late husband's heir, a claim that would not only entitle James to a portion of the Thornton estate, but would also, by extension, give her a legal interest in the affairs of the Cooper family's eldest son. The past, which they had thought buried and defeated, had returned in a new and insidious form. It was not a physical threat, but a legal one, a poisoned quill aimed at the very heart of their family. That night, they called a family council. James, now a man in his own right, sat with them at the long dining table. Daniel and Evelyn laid out the situation, the letter resting between them like a coiled snake. James read the letter, his face hardening as he took in the words. "He wants to claim me," he asked, his voice low and incredulous. "His widow does," Evelyn corrected him, her own voice tight. The old shame, the old feeling of being ruined, tried to surface, but she pushed it down, replacing it with a cold, hard anger. She had fought this battle once. She would fight it again. "We can fight this," Daniel said, his voice a low rumble. "We can say he is my son. That is all. We do not have to give them anything." Evelyn looked at her husband, and then at her son. She had spent a lifetime building a life based on truth and honor. She would not let this ghost from the past force her into the shadows of a lie. "No," she said, her voice ringing with the old, familiar fire. "We will not hide from this. We will not give this woman the power to hold a secret over our heads. We will face it with the truth." She looked at James, her heart aching with love and pride. "You are my son. The circumstances of your conception do not change that. They do not define you. Your father," she said, her gaze shifting to Daniel, "is the man who raised you, who taught you, who loves you. That is the only truth that matters." James looked from his mother to the man he had called father his entire life. He saw the unwavering love and support in Daniel's eyes. He saw the fierce, protective strength in his mother's. He pushed the letter back across the table. "My name is James Cooper," he said, his voice clear and resolute. "My father is Daniel Cooper. This family is my family. Let her file her claim. Let her tell the whole world. It will not change who I am." Daniel reached across the table and put his hand on his son's shoulder, his heart swelling with a pride so immense it felt like it would burst. He had not just raised a son. He had raised a man of honor. "Then we fight," Daniel said, "but not on their terms, and not alone." He stood up and went to his desk. "I will send a wire to Denver in the morning. We are going to hire the best lawyer in the territory. This family does not break, and it does not run." They stood together then, the three of them, a united front against the storm blowing in from the east, the house that had been built on a foundation of a deal of honor, that had been consecrated by a shared crisis and a quiet wedding. was now a fortress, its walls built of love, truth, and the unshakable bond of a family that had chosen to stand together. The year was 1925. The world had been remade by a great war and remade again by the relentless march of progress. Automobiles now rumbled down the paved main street of Pine Creek, sharing the road with the occasional horse and wagon, a stubborn reminder of the town's origins. The soft hum of electricity was a constant backdrop to the familiar sounds of life, a quiet testament to the changes that had swept across the valley. On the porch of the Cooper Ranch, an old man and an old woman sat in their rocking chairs, watching the sun dip low behind the mountains, painting the sky in the same shades of rose and gold as it had on their wedding morning 50 years before. Daniel Cooper was 82, his body stooped and gnarled by a lifetime of hard work, but his eyes were still clear, his gaze still steady. Evelyn, a year younger, was a matriarch in winter. Her once fiery hair now a magnificent silver. Her hands, though wrinkled and thin, still possessed a quiet strength. The fire in her voice had softened to a warm, steady glow, the hearth around which 4 generations of their family now gathered. Their love, born in a dusty street and forged in fire and crisis, had become a quiet, enduring landscape, as much a part of the valley as the mountains themselves. Their children had grown and prospered, their lives a living testament to the values they had been taught. James was now the patriarch of the ranch, a man whose quiet authority was respected throughout the territory. Margaret Rose had married the town's new doctor, her home a center of compassion and healing. The twins, Samuel and Thomas, had become civil engineers, their innovative irrigation systems turning the arid parts of the valley into fertile farmland. And Sarah, their youngest, had become a writer for the Denver Post, her articles giving a voice to the homesteaders and ranchers of the changing West. The final threat, when it came, was not a man with a gun or a poisoned pen. It was a letter from a Chicago development corporation, a cold, impersonal document filled with legal jargon. It arrived on a Tuesday, an unwelcome ghost from a new and rapacious world. The corporation, having discovered an old, ambiguous survey from the territorial days, had found a supposed loophole in the Cooper land titles. They had quietly bought up the loyalty of some of the newer, transient residents of Pine Creek and were now laying legal claim to the entire valley, the land the Coopers and their neighbors had bled and sweat over for half a century. They did not want to be neighbors. They wanted to build a dam, flood the valley, and sell the water rights to the cities growing to the south. The battle that ensued was not fought with Colts, but with depositions and injunctions. It was a new kind of war, and the Cooper children were its generals. They came home, a formidable army of their own, to defend their family's legacy. James rallied the old ranching families, his word as good as his father's. The twins pored over old maps and survey records, their engineers' minds a match for the corporation's slick lawyers. Margaret Rose and her husband gathered medical records and birth certificates, creating a documented history of the community's life and roots in the valley. And Sarah, from her desk in Denver, wrote a series of powerful, impassioned articles about the corporate raiders threatening to wipe a pioneering community off the map. Her stories syndicated in newspapers across the country, turning their private battle into a public cause. The family lawyer, a shrewd, tenacious man from Denver named Webb, built their case brick by brick. He unearthed 47 years of tax receipts, proof of every fence built, every field plowed, every irrigation ditch dug. He found a letter from the Department of the Interior, dated 1882, confirming Daniel Cooper's original claim in language that was plain and direct. He was ready. The final hearing was set for a Friday in the county courthouse. The night before the hearing, a profound, unnatural quiet settled over the ranch. Evelyn, whose heart had been growing weaker for months, seemed to be gathering her strength for the final fight. She sat with Daniel on the porch, her hand in his, watching the stars emerge in the vast, velvet sky. It was never a quiet life. Was it? Daniel, she said, her voice a soft, contented whisper. No, Evelyn, he answered, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. It was not. It was better. She smiled, a faint, lovely curving of her lips. See it through, she said. For them? She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat in a comfortable silence as the moon rose over the mountains. She passed away in her sleep that night, her heart, which had loved so fiercely and fought so bravely, finally giving out. She went peacefully. In the house she had made a home, beside the man who had been her anchor and her harbor. The news fell like a stone over the valley. The fight for the land was forgotten, replaced by a shared, profound grief. But Daniel, his own heart a hollow, aching void, would not allow it. He washed his face, put on his good black suit, and prepared to go to court. His children tried to stop him, to tell him it could be postponed, that he was in no state to face their enemies. He looked at them, his eyes filled with a grief so deep it was bottomless, but also with an unshakable resolve. Your mother told me to see it through, he said, his voice a rough, broken thing. The fire is out, but I can still carry the embers. He walked into the courthouse alone. A frail, stooped old man who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. The courtroom was packed. The corporation's lawyers, in their sharp Chicago suits, sat at their table, a smug, predatory confidence in their eyes. Daniel walked to the front of the room and, with the judge's permission, turned to face the assembly. He did not speak for a long moment. He simply stood there, his gaze sweeping over the faces of his neighbors, his children, and the strangers who had come to take his home. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it filled the room with its raw, simple power. I am not a lawyer, he began. I do not know about loopholes or surveys. I am a rancher. I know about land. I know that you cannot own land. You can only be its steward for a little while. 50 years ago, I came to this valley a lonely man, looking for a quiet life. I did not find it. I found something better. I found a wife, a woman with a fire in her voice and a courage that could tame the wildness in any man's heart. On this land, he said, his voice growing stronger, we built a home. We buried our parents here. We raised 5 children here. Their hands have worked this soil. Their sweat is in this ground. Our lives are in this ground. You did not come here with deeds and titles. You came here with love and with work. This valley is not a line on a map. It is a family. It is a community. And it is not for sale. He finished and stood there for a moment, his statement hanging in the silent room, more powerful than any legal argument. Then he turned and walked back to his seat, his duty done. The verdict, when it came, was a formality. Lawyer Webb presented his mountain of evidence, his 47 years of receipts and letters. The judge, a man whose own father had been a homesteader, looked at the Chicago lawyers with open contempt and dismissed their case with a prejudice that barred them from ever filing it again. The valley was safe. Years passed. The world continued its relentless march forward. But in the small valley in Montana, the Cooper legacy held fast. In the spring of 1948, Daniel Cooper, now 93, passed away in his sleep, his long, eventful life finally at its peaceful end. He was buried on the small hill overlooking the ranch, beside his beloved Evelyn, their shared headstone, carved from a single piece of granite, bore their names and a simple inscription chosen by their children. They built something that lasts. The Cooper Ranch is still there. Automobiles now drive up the long lane, and electric lights glow in the windows. But the old barn still stands, and the smell of hay and horses still hangs in the air. In the main living room, over the great stone fireplace, hangs a portrait of a young woman with fiery red hair and startlingly green eyes. A woman with a fire in her voice that, according to the legend, could burn a man's plans to the ground and build a new world from the ashes. And sometimes, on a quiet summer evening, when the sun is setting and the world is bathed in a soft, golden light, those who pass by the ranch swear they can see 2 figures sitting on the porch in their rocking chairs, a man and a woman, their hands clasped, watching over the valley they loved, their presence as enduring as the mountains themselves. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are tuning in from so we can all connect. And do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.